Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy vs. Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Albertan and Canadian context. If this is your first time joining us, Energy vs. Climate is a live webinar and podcast that drops every other week. Visit energyversusclimate.com to register for updates and get exclusive access to join our live webinars, ask us questions, and engage with us directly. This past summer, we Canadians experienced a pretty oppressive heat dome unlike anything we've experienced before. For most of us, it meant a sweaty week. But for some, hundreds in fact, it was deadly. British Columbia, for example, experienced 600 to 700 deaths attributable to the heat, and that number is probably low. On one night, June 28th, every fire truck in Vancouver was out on medical calls, so not a single station had a truck on hand in case of an actual fire. This is nothing, of course, for anyone who has read the harrowing opening chapter to Kim Stanley Robinson's book Ministry for the Future. While a work of fiction, after this summer it's not hard to imagine millions dying from heat in equatorial and mid-latitude countries in a world with 1.5, 2, or even 3 degrees of warming. July 2021, by the way, was the world's hottest month ever recorded. Is heat the greatest climate threat? To help us answer that question, we were joined by Jeff Goodell. Jeff is the author of 5 books, including Big Coal, The Dirty Secret Behind America's Energy Future, and The Water Will Come, Rising Seas, Sinking Cities, and the Remaking of the Civilized World, the latter of which was a New York Times critic's top book of 2017. He's also a contributing editor at Rolling Stone, where he has covered climate change for more than a decade. Jeff is working on a new book that looks at the impact of heat on humans. That book won't be published for another year, so on the show, we are treated to a sneak peek at some of Jeff's findings. Before Jeff, David started us off with a primer on the epidemiology of heat impacts based on some of his recent research. Now on to the show. All right, David, over to you for the primer.
Thank you. Well, I've been involved, as I probably said before, in the show for 30 years or so in climate. And during most of that time, if you'd asked me what the big climate risks are, and not just me, if you'd asked any random person in the climate expert world, we would have talked about loss of crops or flooding from sea level rise or extreme storms and heat. But we wouldn't have seen heat as that big. And I want to give you a very short summary of some really kind of amazing research by many different authors over maybe the last decade or so that really has quantified using epidemiological methods how bad heat is. So I'll actually show 2 slides, the webinar version. This is just a particular paper, Gasparini et al. There's lots of versions of this. What this shows you, I chose one with Toronto. What this shows you is the relative change in the absolute mortality, number of people who die every day in Toronto normally, as a function of temperature. And what you see, which is very common, is you see a low point, which is defined as 1 here, and then at high temperatures, death rate goes up, and at low temperatures, death rate goes up. You can see it for Sao Paulo, Brazil there. And right away, if you're a Canadian, you might feel proud that we're pretty cold adapted. So the point is, on a cold day in Toronto, deaths don't go up much. And a cold day in Brazil, actually, deaths go up a lot. But that hot peak really goes up steeply in different places. And that's an increase of like a 50% increase in deaths. This is, there's all sorts of sort of powerful stats behind this. I won't go into it, but these are state-of-the-art data and models to really pull out the heat signature here. Let's see if I can move one slide down. This something more complicated graph shows you predictions using that data and using climate models for how the total change in all-cause mortality might change in some different locations under different warming scenarios in different times. So I just want you to plot 2 things. One is northern countries actually benefit. So if you look at Northern Europe has deaths declining due to less cold deaths, and that is about as big as the increase in heat deaths, even out to really bad climate scenarios. Let's say Southeast Asia, that number goes up to sort of 10% increase in excess mortality. And I want to say a little bit about what that is. COVID in the US, which managed it really badly, was about a 15% increase in excess mortality. So the way to think about that is that would be late this century, a COVID every year. And of course, it would jump around a lot. So that means some years it would be many, many COVIDs. A few other really startling facts, to me anyway. One is what I found is just an amazing study. I'm probably in this cohort. It was all America, or a huge chunk of America, 20 million or so. They were in this retrospective study born between about 1960 and the late 70s. And this study pulled out of this amazing noisy data that one extra day above 32 centigrade during the first trimester of pregnancy reduces your income at age 30 by $50. Well, what a weird factoid. But that's 0.1% reduction in your earning potential for every single degree. So 2 days would be 0.2%. And as a little less in the second trimester of pregnancy, these things just show correlation. Nobody knows what it is, but it's probably brain damage. There's now an immense amount of data showing that economic activity scales with heat. So a year that's a degree warmer than normal, a degree Fahrenheit in this case, shows India reducing its economic growth by 17%. So growth was reduced by 17% compared to normal, whereas Sweden goes up by 22%. And that's the Burke-et-al. Paper in Science. There's a lot of versions of that, but this is a big deal. This says that heat and variation of heat is a significant explainer in the relative economic growth rates of the hot world and the cool world. Big deal. And finally, one last one on a specific number from my dear friend Jason Park, who's been a young leader in doing this work and has looked in detail at New York City schools and now some schools in poor countries. And even in New York City schools, in a rich rural place, surprisingly, lots of schools aren't air conditioned, not the poorer ones. And a hot year, a year that's kind of one standard deviation hot, is about as bad as having a one or even a little more than one standard deviation bad teacher. It's a really big impact. And that's presumably, if you believe that teaching teaches you something that you take away for your life, that's a lifelong impact of heat. So I'm going to end there and just say that there really is this all sorts of data that suggests that heat is potentially a dominant human impact of climate change, far exceeding late this century impacts from, say, flooding or air pollution or changing in crops. I don't think we know that for sure, but I think people are really waking up to the idea it may be the big thing. There you have it.
Hey, thanks, David. And I feel like I've lost a bet to you because with this poll question, I thought the suggestive title of today's webinar is Heat the Greatest Climate Threat would bias the poll results. But if you have a look here, only 12% think that heat is the biggest climate impact that worries them the most. The biggest drought is what worries people the most, followed closely at 31% by extreme weather, 29, biodiversity loss 21, heat at 12, and sea level rise at 7.
We should have that whiskey, man.
I should have.
I don't know. I would then adjudicate that bet and say you might have a claim to extreme weather being a heat, as what people were thinking when they clicked that button. So
possibly, but I feel like regardless, I'm eating some humble pie right now. Let's bring in Jeff into the conversation. Jeff, so I want to unpack heat mortality and thermal limits as a starting point. So I know the body functions best at a core temperature, I think of about 35 to 37 C. And if the body's temperature reaches 40 C and it continues to warm or it stays at that level, that's bad. And especially if the body has no chance to cool down, which with this heat dome in Vancouver, that was one of the issues, is that it wasn't cooling off at night and the body never had a chance to cool down. So can you just walk us through with thermal limits, what happens to the body and what really causes the injury or death?
Thanks, Ed. David, that was a great intro. Wonderful to hear. I learned new stuff there also. So I think a couple of things are really important when you think about heat mortality and what it does to our bodies. First is that our bodies are heat machines. We generate heat about as much as a 100-watt light bulb just in our daily life. And we need to release that heat somehow. And the only way that we have to release heat is by sweating. That's how we release heat. Other animals have other methods, but we sweat. And sweating has been a great thing for us as humans. Think about when you go out for a run with your dog on a hot day. You sweat and can keep running. Your dog starts panting, and at a certain point, your dog has to stop running and lay down and pant really hard and release heat. Humans can keep doing this as we're in motion because we can sweat and we can release heat that way. But what happens to our bodies when we get there's a threshold of about 35 C when it's really humid, 35 C wet bulb globe temperature, which takes in sun radiation and some other factors. It's sort of like heat index, where no matter how much we sweat, we can no longer release the heat that we're acquiring and are gaining in our body. Because at that level, if it's a humid day, the sweat is not evaporating. So our only heat releasing mechanism that we have fails. And that is a really important thing to understand, is that there's these certain thresholds. So if it's 35 C and it's a hot, humid day and you're outside and you're doing any kind of physical activity, even for a few hours, you're going to have a heat stroke. That is an absolute, universal kind of limit. Now, it does vary with different people, right? So what happens when your body's trying to deal with heat, your inner body temperature starts rising, and your heart says, okay, we got to get rid of this heat. So what it does is it starts pumping the blood towards your skin, shunting your blood out towards your skin so that it can be picked up by the sweat glands. The heat can be picked up by your sweat glands and dissipated out in sweat. And it works really hard to do that. And the hotter it gets, the harder it works to do that. And one of the things that starts happening is, first of all, if you have heart problems in any way, any kind of heart-related issues, that's a big strain on your heart. So a lot of elderly people who are at risk for other things, the first thing that happens is they have heart attacks in hot weather. But the second thing that starts happening is that if you start pushing so much blood towards your skin that it steals some of your inner organs start being basically blood deprived. And the proteins in your liver, in your intestines and other things start breaking down. And so your heart is racing, your temperature is rising, your inner organs are starting to freak out because they don't have blood. And then if things keep going, once you get up to 102, 103, 104 degrees, depending on different people and things, these organs in your body start literally breaking down, and they start leaking like intestinal fluid into your body cavity and things like that. And you go into what amounts to a kind of septic shock, and you die. And so what kind of happens is that the cellular membrane in your body, when it gets to a certain level, literally melts. And these membranes in your internal organs start to just fall apart, and your body disassembles itself. And so that's the sort of, brief picture of what heat does to one's body. And it's important to say that people have different vulnerabilities depending on their general health and things. But this 35 C limit, wet bulb globe temperature, is pretty universal. And if you're out in that kind of hot, humid heat, but that also shows why dry desert heat and things like that is much more tolerable, because you don't have the problem of, it's much easier to evaporate sweat and dissipate heat in dry, hot weather than it is in wet, hot weather. Mm-hmm. So is that a good?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wanted to better understand, and maybe coming back to one of David's points. So there's heat stroke leading to death. That is an obvious risk, and it's been much covered. But perhaps what do we understand around what he was talking to, some of the longer term impairments or injuries or illnesses? He'd mentioned the correlation between exposure to heat in the womb and reduced income later in life. So what do we know about those who take an injury and unfortunately carry with them for the rest of their lives, and that impairs all sorts of other parts of their lives?
It does. And that's something that there's a lot of ongoing research about. And, one thing to say about that is that, these heat mortality numbers that David cited and that are widely cited are only basically immediate heat stroke deaths. These are deaths that happen, within the time frame of the heat waves and things. And it's very well understood that, first of all, there's a lot of mortality in the weeks and months afterwards due to heart stresses and things like that. And there's also a lot of long-term risks. Some of the ones you talk about with what happens in your sort of brain with learning and things like that are the least understood. But some of the things that are really well understood is, for example, kidney damage, chronic kidney disease, because of what I talked about earlier about the sort of blood being pulled away from internal organs and the cellular membranes of the organs actually breaking down. That is particularly damaging to your kidney, to the many tiny pathways in your kidneys. And so I was just reading a study the other day about an estimate over the last decade in El Salvador and Guatemala of 20,000 deaths related to to kidney disease caused by extreme heat. So it has all of these sort of knock-on effects that, we haven't even begun to calculate.
Got you. And so 20,000, I remember back in 2003, there was a heat wave in Europe that killed 70,000 people. And then heat kills more people in the United States than anything else weather-related on an annual basis. But what do we understand about the extent of the risk? I made reference to Kim Stanley Robinson's book and the first chapter, the harrowing chapter, and frankly, by now, infamous first chapter. I know that I read it, and once you've read it, you can't unread it. It sticks in your brain. And for those who haven't looked at it, it talks about a scenario of, I think it's 20 million Indians dead over the span of a week or two. Are we looking at that type of risk, the extent of that kind of risk in the near future? What do we understand about it?
Well, Stan is a very good writer and he has a very vivid imagination. I think that may be a little beyond the pale of what we're thinking about right now. But I think that the heat mortality risks are widely underestimated. And, even these numbers that we're citing about how many people died in the Pacific Northwest, heat is notoriously sort of difficult to diagnose because you have all these other things like heart attacks and things that don't show up on death certificates. But, there's a study now that estimates global heat deaths right now at over 300,000 a year. It was just published in the Lancet. So, we're looking at massive amounts of deaths, especially as we get closer to these thermal limits. You're seeing it in, regions that are like India, Pakistan, where you have the Middle East, where you have very high temperatures combined with high humidity. And one of the things about heat that is really important to understand about mortality is it's predatory. Mm-hmm. It goes after vulnerable people. It's like, what wolves do to packs. It goes after people who are outdoors, who don't have air conditioning, who are ill, who are elderly, who are very young, people who are, in any way don't have access to the simple things, right? I mean, as you pointed out in the intro, a heat wave is not so bad if you're sitting, in a Harvard classroom and you got air conditioning and a bottle of Evian water sitting next to you. It's like, oh, wow, it's 110 degrees out there. That's really hot. That's not a problem. Right?
Some drive-by slam.
Yeah. He's nice, David. We'll grant him one drive-by.
No, but it's true. It really is there's a lot of talk right now in Glasgow about climate justice. It's what's tearing that conference apart right now. That's the most difficult issue to deal with. And heat is the most vivid embodiment of that. Because if you're a privileged person and you have air conditioning and you have a reliable electricity and you can afford to pay your bills, you're going to be okay. But, there's a lot of people who don't. And I've done a lot of reporting around the world already on this. And, it's not just, people in Pakistan. It's people in Phoenix who live in mobile homes that are like tin boxes that are really, really hot and can't afford to pay their electric bill and think that, oh, if I just turn the AC on for half an hour a day, I'll be okay. And they're not. They die. And, so it really maps to this larger climate justice question more than sort of any other of the climate impacts, I think.
Yeah. And I'd like to get you to tell the story of Sebastian Perez because you've written about them, but I'll preface that with, I've got some information from BC that's kind of hot off the presses, if you will. And I want to give a thank you to Sarah Henderson, who is with the BC Center for Disease Control. and they've looked at the deaths coming from the heat dome in that province in late June and early July of this year. And the short story in terms of risk factors is some of what you would expect. The risk factors, if you're isolated, if you're mentally ill, especially schizophrenia, if you're dependent on substances, you are at higher risk than those without. And the protective factors are privilege and green space. So to that correlation between the link between income and land surface temperature, in other words, neighborhoods have less, there are poor neighborhoods of less green spaces, and therefore they are warmer than richer neighborhoods. So their inhabitants are more at risk. But Jeff, could you tell us the Sebastian Perez story?
Sure. So shortly after during the heat wave that hit Pacific Northwest, I was looking for a way to tell the story about this. And as a journalist, I always look for sort of human stories to tell to make it something beyond numbers and graphs. And I heard about the death of a farm worker in a field in Willamette County, in the Willamette Valley, in Oregon, outside of Portland. And so I went out there and reported the story of what happened to him. And it's a classic story about who's vulnerable in this kind of a situation where we have these extreme heat waves. And he was a Guatemalan migrant. He came across the border about 3 months earlier to work in a nursery in the Willamette Valley. He was married. He wanted to have children. He wanted to build a house for his wife and for his family in Guatemala, and there was no hope of making money to do that there. So he made the journey across, had some relatives who were working in the Willamette Valley, got him a job at this nursery. And, he'd only been there a few months and, was working out in a field. He was one of the field hands. On this particular day, there had been heat warnings. People knew the heat was coming. He knew the heat was coming. He had been in Guatemala. He's not a stranger to heat. And that day, he volunteered to work carrying, moving irrigation pipes around. And we don't know exactly what happened, but what we know is that, at noon, he had been working all morning, sweating hard, went off to do some stuff in the field by himself. And at 3:00 or 3:30 was found by his coworkers dead in the field. And, it's a classic case of, heat exertion, causing, the risk of a heat stroke to rise. There was no shade access to him. Their farm worker protections are very, shall we say, not robust on this. He had access to water. But it brings up, there's two things that I think kind of lessons from it, or there's many, but two things to point out. One is that there's a common idea that if you have access to water, you're going to be okay with heat. And that's just not true. What access to water gives you is it's important to have water in your system in order to not dehydrate so you can stop sweating. But you can easily die of heat stroke in 20 minutes or 30 minutes, no matter how hydrated you are. So that's one thing. The other thing is that there's a notion that people who live in hot climates are better acclimated to it. That if you live in a place like Guatemala, you can handle heat. Or if you live in the Philippines, you can handle heat. But that's just not true. We're all about the same. We can acclimate if you come to a new place for, 4, 5, 6 weeks. Marathoners do this. You can make some incremental changes in your heat tolerance, but beyond that, there's no difference between anybody, whether they grew up in the Philippines, whether they grew up in Toronto. And so he was an example of that also. The last thing I'll say about it is that, as David pointed out in the intro, there's been a new realization about the risks of heat. This is something that people haven't really thought about, despite the fact that climate change was known as global warming for a long time. And we all know, we talk about heat all the time. The real heat risks to our bodies and to workers has not really been thought about. And it's particularly not been thought about for people, on the margins, like farm workers, where only 2 states right now have any kind of heat rules at all about workers, whether they're farm workers or warehouse workers or anyone else. OSHA is working on some now. Gina McCarthy has been a big advocate of sort of pushing for this, but it's really, the sort of Wild West for workers on this.
Sarah, you want to get in?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts on that. Maybe one on that, on your last point about sort of the impact of heat. And I think that is, to me, that's another example of sort of the challenge that we have understanding these kinds of threshold effects, right? We sort of like all have this very linear mindset. And if you move along a heat curve, it's a little bit hotter and a little bit more uncomfortable. And I mean, you can pull up lots of other examples of not understanding kind of nonlinear growth. And I think this to me would be another one where it's like, it sort of defies your, intuition that if it gets a little bit hotter, somehow you're going to go from being able to cope to all of a sudden being dead. And so that's maybe just a little bit thought of where that comes from. But I also wanted to come back to, on this topic of environmental justice and sort of, it is, I think, getting more attention, and that's good. I think it's still sort of layered on top rather than really being fundamentally integrated. But I think we also have to acknowledge that, for the last, 20 years of discussions around addressing climate, it was very much focused on this like cost equation and what's the cost of addressing climate. And there was, essentially in many cases, absolutely no consideration of the costs of not addressing climate, right? And I think that's a big part of what has gotten us to this point. And one could probably trace back where that comes from. And as we're saying, the people that were in the room having these discussions and the economists that we're publishing on, here's the cost, aren't the ones that are out in the fields without access to air conditioning. So I think that, it's not hard to see where these things may have happened. But I think also, even where they are included, it's sort of, people consider the costs in terms of, human life, but also in terms of what you would have to do to adapt to climate as being somehow harder to measure, or, they don't fit within our frameworks. And I think that that's, to me, is a big warning about, where we can end up with this sort of desire to, quantify everything and say that this is what it will cost if we try to reduce emissions. And then the other side of the ledger is a bit messy because it's, frankly, it's just more complicated. So I think that obviously in some sense, some of that is too late, for the people that experience this in BC and in other parts of the world this summer. But I do think that there is something that we can take from that going forwards of just how important it is to do the hard work of integrating costs and thinking about things that don't fit neatly within the analytical tools that we have today. And that, failure to do so is quite literally deadly.
Yeah. There's been some work even up here. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices did a study, was released recently, and it predicted that extreme heat would cause an annual loss of 128 million work hours in Canada, and it's going to cost the economy $15 billion. Now they're projecting that by the end of the century. So who knows with these forecasts, but it's an attempt to quantify it. What I'd like to know, so, we're seeing some effort to quantify the labor cost. Jeff, what do you know about the cost of things like infrastructure? So you get extreme heat, you get roads buckling, you get power grids failing, and then, of course, that compounds the human costs, especially of those who have a power grid goes down, those who need air conditioning in order to stay healthy during a heat wave. What do we know about the risk to infrastructure from heat?
That's a great subject that there's not been a lot of, good sort of work that really quantifies that I've come across. I mean, it's something that I'm exploring in the book, and that certainly what we all saw in the Pacific Northwest with, as you talk about roads buckling, and I was talking just the other day to a head of a big utility out there who was talking about, the problem of power lines sagging, reduced capacity of power lines as they heat up. They can't carry as much current. They sag down. They're more likely to hit trees, torch wildfires. There's this sort of cascading effect of this stuff. And in Phoenix, they'd had to stop flights because the runway was too soft because of the heat for the planes to land and take off. our infrastructure has thermal limits also. We built our world for this sort of Goldilocks zone that we've been living in, right? And we're moving out of the Goldilocks zone. And that has implications for me and for you. It has implications for our airports, our runways, our power system, and of course for the ecosystem more broadly around us. And this is a very sort of idea that's so big it's sort of hard to kind of hold in your head. This notion of this Goldilocks zone, that everything that we build and live with is acclimated to a certain temperature. And that, obviously things can live in really hot environments, and, bacteria live in the hot springs and in Yellowstone and deep thermal vents. Things can live in very cold things, but that's not what they're built to live in. There's not their Goldilocks zone is different than our Goldilocks zone. And so our whole world is moving out of this. And one of the things I'm trying to do in this book is quantify that and talk about that and show that it's not, the human mortality is only just one small piece of this larger change of rising heat.
Of course, I think it's politically, we don't say it because we all want climate action, but of course the whole world isn't moving out of it. That's part of the lesson you get from Burke and all these different studies, is that in fact there are economic benefits to the cooler countries. And I think that hasn't kind of entered into politics. I think one of my questions is, when will it? Ed, I haven't looked at the study you cited about Canadian heat loss, but I wonder if that was a deliberately political study that only cited the hot side. That graph I showed at the beginning shows the hot side and the cold side, and all these analysis use both. And that's why you get an overall benefit in Sweden, economic benefit from a little bit warmer. And my guess is the same is true in Canada, but people just don't want to say it because, of course, we all want climate action. And I think my question for Jeff is, in what point is the stark reality that in crude economic terms, if these studies are right, that in fact some northern countries are, it's a wash or maybe even a small benefit to get somewhat warmer, whereas it's horrifically bad for the hottest countries?
Yeah.
David, maybe just one twist to add on that for Jeff to answer too, because this is actually not clear to me, is in those studies, how does time to adapt the infrastructure, as Jeff was talking about, get taken into account there, right? Because I think that much like the organisms that have adapted to live places and how we have built our world, those previously temperature changes were much slower and they took much longer, and they were more they took place over the times that were the time of evolution of animals, or at least of movement of their habitat, and certainly over the time of the infrastructure, say, of building a house. Now, as we saw in a place like Calgary last summer, people were very uncomfortable in the summer here because many of them don't have air conditioners. Now, of course, you can say there is, if you have the money, an answer there, but adapting those living places takes time. So I guess I wonder also then in those studies that show sort of the potential advantage of the warming, is that still true if you consider, the short time period over which that happens, and therefore that we have to adapt our infrastructure and the cost that adaptation takes?
Studies fundamentally look at year-to-year variations in GDP compared to year-to-year variations in temperature. And because the adaptation is baked in, so the point is, even Sweden, I'm speaking of that because we look at the data, even Sweden is a cold country, so it's done its adaptation, but it's still true relatively that the Swedish GDP grows faster on a year that's a little bit warmer, whereas the Indian GDP grows slower on a year that's warmer.
So this, I think, is all true, but I think that we humans are not good. We're good at talking about this kind of stuff, in seminars like this. But when it comes to actually happening in real time, no one's going to notice, the Corn Belt has moved, 10 miles north or 15 miles north. I mean, all this stuff is going to happen, in its own kind of way. And, COVID and the history of climate response has shown anything, is that we're not very good at, thinking ahead about how to deal with this kind of stuff. And to the point that, it's going to be good for some places, that's certainly true. I mean, wheat and corn will grow farther north in Canada than it does now. There's a lot of studies showing the Corn Belt moving north, right? I mean, there's going to be a lot of changes that way. But, if anything, this heat wave in the Pacific Northwest shows, how vulnerable places that they think are safe are, right? I mean, the problem in the Pacific Northwest was that nobody had air conditioning. I think the penetration in Seattle was 20% or something, and nobody was thinking about it. Nobody was prepared for it. Some of my friends here, I'm in Austin, Texas, and some of my friends here, half joking, half serious, point out that, people in Washington and British Columbia just don't know how to handle heat. They don't know what to do. And, that's kind of a callous thing to say, but it is kind of true, right? And so, I mean, no one's going to get out free in this, right? And this notion that it's going to be good for the North and bad for the equatorial, tropics and things is true, but it's also going to accelerate all of these climate justice questions and things. When you have a heat wave that kills 75,000 people in Pakistan and causes huge unrest God knows there's, India, Pakistan is not a sort of tranquil region of the world. What are the implications of that? What are the national security implications of that? How do we as moral humans think about that, right? So it's a really complex, equation.
Yeah, it reminds me, and on a COP note, Glasgow is happening now. I was at the Cancun COP in 2010, and I remember taking in a presentation by senior military brass across the U.S. forces. And the simple message was climate change is real. It poses real threats to American security, sort of following along Wynne Dyer's climate wars thesis. You disrupt precipitation in Mexico, that could cause an illegal immigration or refugee crisis or exacerbate the existing crisis. And we can do something proactively about it, or we can do something retroactively about it and, go in and basically take care of these conflicts once they've happened. But, getting back to air conditioners, there's a big difference in heat deaths under that heat dome between British Columbia and Oregon, because in Oregon, you have more air conditioners than you do in BC. And to Sarah's point, we haven't thought that we've actually needed them. That is, to be clear, a solution. Air conditioning can protect people, but it's a very expensive one, and it's going to put further stress on our already stressed electricity grids, which, as we talked about earlier, may be more stressed through an extreme heat event. So to pivot now a little bit from the doom and gloom side, and yes, Mom and Energy versus Climate listeners, my mom is a loyal listener, and she said, is this episode going to be really depressing? I hope not, because we're going to end on a positive note before we take questions. So to pivot, what can we do, Jeff, beyond just trying at exorbitant costs to install a bunch of air conditioners around the world?
Well, the good thing about heat mortality, as we've been talking about it, is, that it's a very preventable. I mean, it's obviously things like air conditioning. I strongly reject the notion that heat's not a problem because we can just buy everybody air conditioners and all that. We have 800 million people in the world who don't even have electricity, much less air conditioning, right? So the idea that we're just going to buy everybody air conditioners is not a solution. But there are a lot of solutions, and there are a lot of things that can hugely reduce the risk of heat. Planting shade trees, just having, more green spaces in our world, having better social outreach so that, your aunt who has a heart murmur is not alone in her apartment when it's 107 degrees. There's a lot of push from people like the Red Cross and others to have these heat activation networks that really try hard to mobilize the network of people to make sure that people are not alone during this, and that they understand the risks. They have access to water and things like that. And they don't think, I'm just going to tough this out. I'll be fine. It's not going to get that hot. I'll be fine. So, compared to things like, sea level rise, for example, which is not a huge, nobody dies from sea level rise directly. You don't stand on the beach and water rises and you drown, right? I mean, you can increase storms and things like that. But sea level rise has enormous financial implications because you have all this built infrastructure on the coast and all that kind of thing. Heat mortality is not like that, right? This is relatively plastic. We can do a lot. We can change how buildings are insulated. We can change, we can plant trees. We can do these social activation of things. So I actually think it's a very kind of, the problems go to the larger economic problems of the economic divide, having prosperity people to be able to pay electric bills, things like that. That, the larger economic inequalities are a big driver in this. But there's really a lot that can be done in a very immediate, direct, it's going to be hot next weekend. Let's make sure we don't have 70,000 people dying here. I think that it's very hopeful in that sense.
I want to point to an example that I learned about when I was in Bangladesh a year and a half ago, which is not about adaptation to heat, but I think it tells you about how powerful knowing that something's going to happen and responding in a planned way can be. So the Bangladesh monsoon around 1970-71, during the war that formed the country, was by many measures the worst natural disaster of human history. So it killed something like 500,000 people. There was another monsoon of similar storm surge with similar intensity about a decade ago. I forget the exact date. And it killed about 500 people, which I don't mean to minimize, but a much smaller number. And that was fundamentally because cell phone-based warning systems and a planned decision that when people are warned, they get into shelters, which are mostly schools, because you only have to get a few meters higher and you're not going to die. It's not fun, but you're not going to die. And that's really dramatic. And my sense is that it actually would be possible at cost and reasonable to do some of the same things for heat. So you could have shelters that were air conditioned and you could have obviously engineer those shelters to have much more stable, much more higher probability air conditioner won't fail than the regular power grid. You could obviously do white roofs. There's a bunch of things. And the social thing that Jeff mentioned turns out to be a big deal. Getting old people out of the social network that gets an old person out of the top floor of a building can be a big deal. If you say British Columbia with the same technology, had we had the social system in place already that says if it's getting really hot, you check on your neighbors. And if Sally has air conditioner, the other neighbors go to Sally's house on a super hot day. Those things can actually make a big deal. So I actually think there's a lot of room for adaptation if we know that there's a problem and we act in a coherent way and solve it. I mean, obviously the biggest way to do is to cut emissions. Just assume we all know that.
Right.
Yeah, and I think the political will has to be there, and there is examples. I think that France was a place that saw a lot of deaths in that 2003 heat wave, and they did, I think, prepare better and did fare better by doing a lot of the things that you're mentioning, David, around having people check on elderly neighbors and also have kind of more centralized cooling centers. So I think certainly there's a piece to work on there. I mean, I do think it's worth just underscoring again the emissions reduction side of things, right? Because that is, I guess I personally maybe don't spend a lot of time thinking about these kind of heat challenges and what that means, and spend more time just thinking about how we have to reduce emissions. But it is a little bit sobering again to hear, and think about really the challenges that sit behind there. But I think that on a practical level, it means that we have to continue and accelerate our efforts on emissions reduction, but it also means that we need to find ways to integrate these adaptation questions, I think, across all of the things that we're doing on the policy side as well, too, and the development side as well, too. And so, to specific examples of that, I mean, there's a lot of interest in how do we manage a grid to integrate more variable renewables? And one way to manage the variability that I think we've talked about previously is this idea of demand side management, right? And using financial tools to get people to use electricity at different times of the day. But when we start talking about getting to temperatures where access to electricity really becomes a question of impacting mortality, I think we have to be very careful as we're designing these kinds of systems and really think about what is the basic, especially in a warmer world, what is the basic level of access to electricity and to cooling systems that is sort of really necessary for sustaining life, that we have to make sure that, whatever electricity time shifting mechanisms we're using, respects that and doesn't get people to just switch off their air conditioning or their fans over 3 days when it's hot because they simply can't afford it. I think the flip side of that is, there are also some technological options there, and actually moving the generation or the consumption of electricity for cooling pre-cooling is something that you can do across a day in even relatively simple ways, right? There's like both everything from pre-cooling buildings to getting a little bit more complicated and doing things like making ice within big chillers that are then used during the hottest part of the day to provide the air conditioning. So there's a lot of what I would call, that it's not even quite high tech, it's like mid tech tools that are there. But our markets, our electricity systems aren't set up, to do that. And so I think that's something that we need to work on as well. And of course, I have to bring up heat pumps because now I am officially sponsored, and I got a free T-shirt that said, "Hi, I love heat pumps," which doesn't actually impact my view of them, But that's another area where you say, okay, well, if everybody's going to be rushing to install air conditioners, what do we do to make sure that they at least install a heat pump instead, right? And if the marginal cost of that is relatively small, is that a place where regulation should come in? Because it's we've been having this discussion, I think, on Twitter over the last week or so. But even if you want to have a heat pump installed in your home in Calgary, it's pretty hard to find someone who will do it. You'll find a lot of people tell you it makes no sense whatsoever, in any reason. So I think those are the kinds of things that are. It's tricky because we're trying to solve a number of problems at the same time when you talk about climate mitigation, adaptation, and equality issues. And so that's a lot harder in a sense on the policy side than just solving one of those. But of course, it also, is a big opportunity because if you can get things right, then you manage to address a number of those challenges at the same time and in probably a more efficient way.
That's great. And I love heat pumps. T-shirts available at sarahhastings.com.
I'm just in it for the T-shirts. Yes,
there's some basics here, and it's not high tech; it's low tech. Better ventilation in Amazon warehouses, for instance. I personally, back in my early 30s, had a summer job building split unit air conditioners for Matsushita in Japan on an assembly line. It's building air conditioners in a building with no air conditioning in the middle of the Japanese summer. So I've experienced the inanity personally. But I wonder, and to an earlier point, emergency response preparation, we just have to get better. And BC, in our case, was caught flat-footed. A fire station chief called her parents during the middle of that heat dome and said, if you think you're at risk of heat stroke and you're getting sick, don't call 911 because you might not get through, or in one case, you'll wait 17 minutes. Go seek help directly. That is clearly a system level failure if that happens. But I wonder, Jeff, before we turn to audience Q&A, is there something, do we just need like a UN declaration that no one should die from heat? Like, is that part of it?
Well, that's an interesting idea. Heavy emphasis on the should in that sentence. But yeah, I do think that, but of course, saying no one should die from heat means like, okay, well, how do you deal with the just gaping, economic inequalities that make people victims to heat? So it's unfortunately, it's sort of like a morally a great proclamation that, when you begin to think about how do we implement that, gets very complicated very quickly, right? And so, dealing with heat is just wound up with dealing with all kinds of other things like health insurance, like well-paying, decent-paying jobs. I think you can make a strong argument that, raising the minimum wage or a higher basic minimum wage would do more to help people, deal with extreme heat than almost anything. And, I think that there's lots of ways that you can sort of go at this. And that's the tricky thing about it is that it exposes all these other sort of vulnerabilities.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks, Jeff. Now let's, the long-awaited audience Q&A. We'll go to our go-to questioner, provocateur, Robert Tremblay. You have a question.
Yeah, thanks. So I guess this question is, maybe meant to be a bit provocative, just maybe a question to David or it's a bit of debate amongst the panelists. But so David, I think I've heard him say a couple times that, temperature going up in general is a good thing economically. So maybe there's a case that Alberta or Canada will benefit from rising temperatures. I guess I'm wondering, is that including context of stuff like potential droughts? What Sarah said about infrastructure spending to adapt to different temperatures or political instability for immigration pressure? Is it looking at it holistically, or are we just kind of simply saying like increase in temperature is an increase in GDP?
I mean, the statistics that do that are just what I said earlier. I think I want to encourage you, we all got to be careful about cherry picking to support a political point of view. So if you're going to use all this new econometric data to say how bad heat is, which I think overall is what it says, and it says we should take climate change much more seriously, you can't say, oh, I believe this econometric data everywhere except the places where it shows there's some climate benefit. So of course, it doesn't get every single one of those things, but these are pretty robust things. And there's some of the key studies that people are now using. Actually, to get back to, I think, Jeff's comment, we just circle back to Jeff's interesting comment over to him about the nerdiness, or no, actually, sorry, it was more Sarah early on. You talking about the fact that it's harder to quantify the climate impacts. And so therefore we haven't paid enough attention to climate impacts. I think a big thing that's happened in the last decade is this data that shows very clearly overall the economic and now the mortality impact of climate change, I think is playing a role in convincing people to act more on climate. And I guess I would say to you, Robert, you can't both buy that data insofar as it says things are bad and then kind of don't buy the other side of it, because it's really inherent in all those curves. You get a cool disbenefit and a hot disbenefit. It's deep in that data. I think if it's not real, then those studies have a deep flaw, and then you can't trust the idea that warmth is bad either.
Maybe in the interest of time, we'll leave it at that. And I saw you also had a note, Robert, that you'd like us to expand more on that point on the benefits versus disbenefits to Canada in a warming world. And perhaps we could do a whole show topic on that. Donald Darnell, you've got a question as well.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah,
great. Yeah. I want a t-shirt too, by the way. I'm a big fan of heat pumps. I had another question, not to pick on you, David, about the statistical evidence you provided at the beginning, which I found really compelling, and particularly the fatality charts for different regions impacted. And do I understand correctly that those are just looking at the effects of average temperature increase on fatality? Or because it's my impression that we should anticipate with climate change, with global warming, increased variability and a wider range of extremes also. And I just wonder if those statistics take those into account.
So those stats are all backward looking. They don't have anything to do with climate change. They're observations. And they're not actually instantaneous temperature. They almost all use these weird spline fit functions that deal with the harvesting problem. So Jeff mentioned this is a grim tale, but epidemiologists will use that word. So the point is, after a big air pollution episode, you get a lot of deaths, but then a few days later, you get deaths going below the norm because you've harvested people who are going to die anyway. So you actually have to do a weird spline fit function. And that's sort of deep in the way all these epidemiological studies work. So in fact, what Jeff was saying, we don't count them in some ways. So the answer is, what I'm showing you is the second level fit. And under that, there's this two-dimensional spline function where it actually has to deal with that harvesting business. So overall weighting is kind of over 20 days when it's non-flat weighting. But that just tells you how people respond to the temperature. Then you can look at a climate model, and then I turn over to Jeff. Yeah, of course, climate models show it gets more variable, which is part of the reason you're going to get a lot more mortality. And that's why, I think what I haven't actually seen is a paper that investigates the probability of the Kim Stanley Robinson scenario. So I showed you a paper that showed you average all-cause mortality going up 10% to Southeast Asia, which is huge. But there's going to be a huge amount of variability around that. And I don't know what the probability of the Kim Stanley Robinson 20 million event is in later this century. I mean, maybe over to Jeff more to sort of speculate about. Really up to me, especially about what all this means, how it changes the politics of this topic.
That's an interesting question about how it changes the politics of the topic. I mean, there's lots of studies showing that as, average temperatures increase, the extremes increase also, right? The sort of bell curve moves farther, to the right. Whether a Kim Stanley Robinson scenario can happen, I mean, that's just there's so many variables in that, and depending on what the temperature is and where it is. I mean, I think that is clearly, it would take, something that's really, really extreme, that beyond our capacity, I think, of even the most sort of any climate modeler that I know to get the kind of heat wave that would kill that many people in a place like India right now. But we are moving in that direction, right? I mean, we are moving in that direction because we are moving into a world where, right now in parts of Pakistan, you have, I think this year there were 12 days a year that were above the 35 C wet bulb globe temperature that I mentioned before. And 6 years ago, there was one. And, the movement in this direction is clear. So as we get more and more of these days where you're above the human threshold, then you're going to get, sort of more and more deaths and more harvesting. But I think the interesting question that we haven't really talked about, David, you brought up a little bit, is this question of how it changed politics. I mean, that's especially in the context of COVID, where we're dealing with, how has all these deaths that we've all been witnessing in real time changed the politics of our response to COVID and how we think about pandemics? It's not hard to conceive of a heat wave that kills 100,000 people in India or Pakistan or somewhere, Iran or somewhere like that, somewhere that's very vulnerable. Do we care? I mean, honestly, do we in the West, the people who make policy, care? I mean, I don't know. It's interesting what the sort of human threshold is for death and how that changes politics. And it's a crude question, but especially in the context of COVID, it's one that's worth asking. And I don't know what the answer is. I would love to say that it would mobilize people, that we would, in Kim Stanley Robinson's book, it does. It starts a whole, apparatus of dealing with climate change from a financial point of view and all kinds of things, including solar engineering. But would that really happen in our world? I don't know. I would not bet on it.
And just hot pursuit. Then, Sarah, I know you want to jump in. That happened in his book. And again, it's a work of fiction. But what really got the U.S. moving in his book was heat deaths in the U.S. It didn't, and on an order of magnitude less than what had happened in that harrowing opening chapter to India in the book. But sorry, Sarah, over to you.
No. And I think there is that very real political reality. I also think it's true that, we shouldn't sit in Canada and say, well, maybe if our GDP goes up a bit, then climate change is good and we don't care about, people that are going to die elsewhere. I mean, I think that's obviously not a moral statement to make. But I think also it's, maybe to end on a slightly happier note, I do think that we are certainly closer than ever before in getting on a trajectory that at least limits the temperature rise over the last, 20 years that we've been working on this challenge. I think coming out of, COP26, we are getting closer to limiting that to, 2 degrees or even potentially 1.5, probably closer to 2. And that actually also then changes the economics and the politics for places that are big, fossil fuel producers. And there was a really interesting paper that came out in Nature, Climate or Energy this week that really said that once you're on the trajectory that we are on, it's no longer advantageous for even higher cost fossil producers to free ride because of the cost basically of stranded assets, and that we are better off even from a purely economical standpoint in starting to take action on our emissions as well too. So I think that we're, I hope that some of the discussion has moved away from a world where, we're debating whether or not we should act on climate because it's too expensive, to one where we, do realize that is what actually makes more sense also even for a, fossil producing region like Alberta.
Mm-hmm. All right. We've got to wrap, but I want to put one more question to Jeff to take advantage of him being here. And Jeff, maybe like a 15 or 20 second answer. And something I've wondered, and another listener has wondered, are there negative health impacts on us from moving to really hot environments, say outside, and then you walk into a building that's got air conditioning and it's set to 18 and 19? You're going back and forth between those two environments. Is that bad on the body?
Well, it stresses your heart a little bit, but it's certainly better to be, outside in 120 degrees and walking into a refrigerator and then out into 120 degrees than being stuck in 120 degrees. So, I mean, I think that, your body does sort of get a little bit of a ping pong, but I've never heard anybody that in the researchers that I've talked about talk about that as a serious sort of risk that we need to be aware of. I mean, there is questions about, thermal adaptation. If you're used to being in an air conditioning room all the time, all of a sudden you walk out into 120 degrees and decide, I'm going to go for a 5-mile run, you may end up dead at mile 4.5, right? But I don't think the back and forth thing is a big issue.
Gotcha. I've wondered that, especially when I've been in Japan in the summer, going from the Japanese summer heat into buildings that were air conditioned, unlike the building that I was in when I was building air conditioners. So thanks. Good to know. Let's wrap. So thanks so much, Jeff. This was fantastic. I don't think we ended on a doom and gloom note, Mom. I think we covered a lot of important territory. So really appreciate having you on the show, Jeff.
Thanks for having me. It's a great conversation.
Thanks a lot.
A reminder, this episode is going to be available at our site, energyversusclimate.com. Wherever you do listen, rate us. That really helps. Our next episode is going to come out in a couple weeks' time. It's actually going to be about careers in low carbon energy. It'll be a different format. So we're looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy it. Give us feedback at energyversusclimate@gmail.com. Support us through donations at energyversusclimate.com. We'll be back in a couple weeks' time. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu. Mika McFarlane provides webinar support. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com. Interact with us live every other week and subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen.